A single photograph. For over a century, it sat untouched in an archive, labeled simply as Family Portrait, 1904. It was admired for its composition, its clarity, its quiet dignity. Nothing about it suggested it was anything more than history frozen in time. But when modern restoration technology finally scanned it at microscopic resolution, something appeared that no one had ever seen before. Something that made the archivist stop breathing for a moment. What they discovered would rewrite not just one family's story, but how we understand inheritance itself. If you want to uncover stories history forgot to explain, stay with this journey. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1904. Inside a small photography studio owned by a man named Henri Duval, one of the few photographers in the city known for taking portraits of working-class black families with unusual care and respect. The studio was dim but warm, lit by hanging gas lamps that cast soft amber light across painted backdrops of imagined worlds, grand staircases, marble halls, European libraries that none of his clients had ever been allowed to enter, except here, in illusion. That morning, a family arrived for a portrait, the Laurent family. Jean Laurent, the father, was a dock worker by trade, but his posture carried the quiet authority of someone who had learned discipline the hard way. His wife, Elise Laurent, wore a deep blue dress carefully stitched and clearly repaired more than once, yet worn with elegance that no poverty could diminish. Around them stood their children, arranged carefully by height and age, each one instructed to remain perfectly still. But it was the youngest that drew attention, even in that moment. Lucien Laurent, 6 years old. Small frame, oversized shoes borrowed from an older cousin, eyes too observant for his age. He stood slightly forward of the rest, exactly where the photographer placed him for balance in the composition. Henri adjusted the family carefully. "Chin up," he said softly. "Do not move. Think of something you love." Lucien stared at the camera. The shutter clicked. And for a fraction of a second, light carved the family into permanence. The photograph was printed, delivered, and eventually carried through generations of moves, wars, and migration. It survived floods, storage boxes, forgotten attics, and eventually ended up donated to the Louisiana Historical Archive, where it was cataloged and forgotten again. For 119 years, no one questioned it. Until Dr. Camille Rousseau, a forensic imaging specialist, was assigned to digitize fragile early 20th century photographs using a new quantum resolution scanner designed to recover detail beyond traditional optical limits. When she placed the Laurent family portrait under the scanner, she expected nothing unusual. At first, everything looked normal. The fabric textures, the subtle cracks in the emulsion, even dust embedded in the original glass plate, all beautifully preserved. Then she zoomed in on Lucien. Something felt wrong, not aesthetically, anatomically. She increased magnification, then again, and again, until the image stopped behaving like an old photograph and started behaving like a medical scan. "Wait," she whispered. Lucien's right hand. There were 6 fingers, not distorted, not overlapping, not an artifact of motion blur. 6 fully formed digits, each with distinct joints, tendons, nails, perfectly natural, resting calmly against his mother's dress. She zoomed out, then checked the left hand. 5 fingers. She zoomed back in. 6 on the right. Her hands left the keyboard for a moment, because the implication was immediate. This wasn't a random defect. It was consistent anatomy, a trait. Within hours, she contacted Dr. Elias Mercer, a geneticist specializing in rare limb development disorders. When he arrived, he didn't speak at first. He simply stared at the image for nearly a full minute. "That's not a deformity," he finally said. "That's a stable expression of post-axial polydactyly, fully functional." Then he leaned closer. "And it looks inherited." What followed was not a single discovery, but a collapse of assumptions. They traced the Laurent family through fragmented census records, church registries, and port employment logs. Dock workers, carpenters, metal workers, always skilled trades, always precise work, always hands. The pattern emerged slowly. Lucien's descendants appeared in New Orleans city records well into the 1930s. Then the Great Migration scattered branches of the family northward: Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. In each branch, there were whispers in medical files, notes that were never considered important, extra digit present at birth, family reports same trait in father, declined surgical removal. Then came the message that changed everything. A pediatric surgeon in Toronto named Dr. Adrian Keller submitted a DNA match to a public genealogy database while researching his own ancestry. He didn't expect a response, but he got one within hours. When he arrived at the research lab, he didn't bring documents. He brought his hand, 6 fingers on the right. "My family always called it the maker's hand," he said. That phrase changed everything for Dr. Mercer, because it appeared in an 1890 church record from New Orleans, and again in a 1912 Carpenters Guild ledger, and again in a 1940 oral history transcript. Maker's hand, not medical terminology, cultural language. A trait reinterpreted as identity. Genetic sequencing confirmed it weeks later. A rare regulatory variant affecting limb bud development pathways, consistent with a stable GLI3 associated expression pattern. But what stunned the researchers was not the mutation itself, it was its continuity. At least 9 generations, possibly more. And then came the anthropological breakthrough. A forgotten French colonial field journal from West Africa, dated 1876, describing a coastal woodworking guild where certain families were said to have double articulation of the final digit, believed to enhance carving precision. The journal dismissed it as superstition, but the pattern was identical. The lineage stretched further than anyone expected. From West Africa, across forced displacement, through survival, through craftsmanship, through silence, until now. The museum eventually built an exhibition around the discovery titled The Hands That Remember. At its center was the Laurent family photograph, Lucien's 6-fingered hand enlarged until every detail became visible. Visitors stood in silence longer than expected. Some cried. Some simply stared. Because the question was no longer medical. It was human. What does it mean when something labeled as abnormal is actually a lineage of skill? Years later, Dr. Keller stood with his daughter in front of the original photograph. She was 8. She studied Lucien's hand closely. "Did he know?" she asked. "He probably didn't think it mattered," he said. She looked down at her own hands. 5 fingers on the left, 6 on the right. Then she smiled. "It matters now." That night, she wrote a letter to Lucien. Not because she expected an answer, but because somewhere in time, a child had once stood still for a photograph, and unknowingly made himself visible enough for the future to finally understand him.